to start our first official lesson. We'll start with national income accounting. In this lesson, we will discuss how to measure our well-being as an individual, a family, and an economy. By economy, we mean the city economy, the economy of a city, the economy of a state, or the economy of a nation. In this course, almost all the time, we are focused on the economy of a nation, specifically the United States. Next, we will also learn how to measure output, how much output is produced, and what is it being used for, how much income is being earned, how much is being spent, and we will also learn the relationship between production, income, and spending. Now, let's just first put aside the economy. Let's just consider an individual or a family. We can easily extend the discussion to the economy later. After all, the economy is made up of individuals and families. So, in our daily conversation, when you say, my friend Jason is doing very well, or wow, that person looks like he's doing not too well. What do you mean by that? What are some of the things that you observe that make you say that? In other words, what are some of the indicators that you look at when you decide that, well, this person or this family is doing well or not doing so well? Right? So why don't we take a minute or so? Okay? So I'm going to let you work, okay, for a minute or so to write down these indicators. Let's go. Okay, now let's compare notes. I'm sure that many of you, okay, will look at, what kind of cars that he's driving, or what kind of house this person is living in. Okay? Or sometimes some of you will look at, what kind of financial investment he has made. He owns a lot of Google shares, okay, Facebook shares, things like that. Okay, so asset. Okay. Some of you would also say that, well, wait a minute, we don't want to just look at how much a person owns, but instead you will also want to look at, how he pays for them, because a lot of people are, in debt. And although he drives a nice car, he lives in a nice house, that may not mean that he's doing very well financially. So in other words, some of you would also look at, debt, okay, debts, okay, credit card loans, things like that. Okay? Many of you will probably think about how much he earns. You look at how much he earns, the income. Okay. And some of you would say that because he lives in a nice neighborhood, or he lives in a neighborhood that is not so nice. Okay? So some of you will look at the social status. Okay? Okay, so does he have very powerful friends? Okay. So what kind of people he hangs out with, okay? And then some of you will look at education. Okay? Generally speaking, the higher the education, the higher the income. Education is a good indicator of future income. And then some of you will also look at some of you will also look at, when you look at the neighborhood, you look at what? Clean, right? How clean it is. Okay. Let's put it here. How clean it is. Okay. How safe it is, right? Saved, right? One thing that many of us tend to leave out is health, which is a very important indicator of the well-being of an individual or a family. Okay? But unfortunately, a lot of times we leave that out. Okay? And also, you want to look at what? Happiness. Okay? Right? And this is also another thing that we tend to leave out. Okay? Unfortunately, once again, this is probably the single most important indicator of the well-being of an economy, of an individual or a family. Well, there may be some good reasons why we tend to leave out some of these key indicators. Okay? When you look at the list, okay, I'm sure you can add a lot more to the list, but when you look at the list, okay, some of them are very well defined. That means everybody knows what that means. Okay? For example, assets. Okay, so everybody knows what that means, right? Things that we owned, right? Income. Okay? Everybody knows what that means. Money that we earned, when we work. And they are also easily quantifiable. So that means we can easily put a number to it. For example, income. Okay? So easily measurable, easily quantifiable. You get your paycheck, that's your income. Okay? But on this list, you can also see that there are things that are not so easily quantifiable. Okay? So to make it worse, there are things that are not so well defined. For example, happiness. How do you define happiness? How do you define happiness? How do you measure happiness? Okay? So health. Okay? So how do you define health? Health. I mean, what do you mean by a healthy person? Does that mean that he visits hospitals? He doesn't visit hospitals so much. He doesn't see his doctor so much. But maybe that's because he's afraid of seeing his doctors. So he waits till it is too late, right? So in other words, these are things that are not so easily quantifiable. I mean, we have people out there, we have economists out there who have constructed indexes for health to measure how healthy individuals are, indexes for the environment, how clean or how polluted our environment is. But none of these are absolutely objective. Okay, so they're not so quantifiable, unlike assets, debts, and income. Okay, so in this course, you will find that we tend to focus a lot on indicators that are easily quantifiable. and well defined. So the whole reason of this exercise is I don't want you to think that macroeconomists are a bunch of, cold-hearted jerks who don't care about the environment, who don't care about the happiness, who don't care about the health. No, we do care about those things. But for the purpose of, learning in macroeconomics, we tend to focus on indicators that are well defined, and easily quantifiable. But just so you know, there are health economists and environmental economists who study these issues. Okay? So now, let's turn to the first economic indicators. Okay? One of the most important economic indicators is the output. The output, simply put, is the amount of goods and services produced by an economy. However, output is actually not an observable variable. In other words, nobody really knows the true value of output of an economy. Okay? That's because we cannot possibly go around the economy and collect information of every single item that is produced by this economy. It's impossible. So as a result, economists and statisticians try to construct some proxies, try to construct some indicators to hopefully capture the true value of the output. One of the most commonly used indicators, one of the most commonly used proxy of output these days is GDP, gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is the total market value of all final goods and services produced within a nation's borders in a given time period. It is a very short definition, but it contains a lot of important clauses. First, market value. In order to be counted as the GDP of an economy, the good or the service has to have a market value. Take, for example, underground activities. So illegal drugs, crystal meth, okay? Very valuable. Okay? So it's worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Okay? But how are we going to measure it? Can you imagine an economist going to the alley and talk to the drug dealer and ask, hey, how much crystal meth have you sold this today? How much does it go for these days? Okay? I don't think so, right? Okay? So because of that, all these illegal activities, underground activities, as valuable as they are, because there is no market value, we cannot count them as GDP. Okay. So next, in order to be counted as the GDP, a good has to be a final good. Okay, a final good, okay? Or a final service. In other words, these are the goods and services that reach their ultimate users. So take, for example, a bakery. A bakery buys some flour and makes into bread. Flour, in this context, in this case, is not a final good. It is what we call an intermediate good. Let me just put it here. Intermediate. Oops, it's not working. Let's see if I can insert a new slide. Okay. Intermediate good. So intermediate good is good that has not reached its final user. Okay. Intermediate good. Okay. So in the example that we've just talked about, flour is an intermediate good. Okay. It cannot be counted as GDP because the final good, a bakery doesn't sell flour. A bakery sells bread. And the price of bread is likely to have included the cost of flour. So by including the flour, the price of flour, we are doing debit counting. So we are not including the cost or the price of flour when we calculate the GDP. Another thing that we have to pay attention is this phrase here. Within a nation's borders, okay? Within an economy's borders. So in this course, obviously, we are focused mostly on the economy of the nations. Okay? So a lot of times we use the word an economy with countries interchangeably. Okay? So take, for example, if we want to count the GDP of the United States, we only look at goods and services that are produced within the border of the United States. Take, for example, General Motors is an American company. When General Motors produces cars in Japan, okay, those cars are not considered the GDP of the United States. They are considered the GNP of the United States. Okay? So they are not considered GDP of the United States. They are considered the GDP of Japan, okay? Because it takes place within the border of Japan. Okay? Another thing that we also have to pay attention is that when we measure the GDP, it is time specific. So if we are talking about the GDP of 2017 quarter four, we're not looking at the GDP of 2017 quarter three. Okay? So it is time specific. One thing that I do have to mention before we move on to an exercise is that we want to bear in mind that output or GDP is denominated in monetary terms. So we are not measuring output in units. Okay? So in this example, in this hypothetical economy, in this hypothetical economy, people produce 2 billion oranges, 20 cents each. So that comes up to $400 million. And they produced 2 million bicycles, $50 each, and that comes up to $100 million. And they go to concerts at night, so there are 700 rock concerts each year, and each concert costs or it's priced at $1 million. So that's $700 million. Together, that adds up to an output of $1,200 million, which is $1.2 billion for this hypothetical economy. So we're not measuring the output in units. Okay, so that's the point. So I briefly mentioned GNP just now. So now let's just talk about the distinction between GDP versus GNP. GNP was a very important proxy of output. Okay? So before 1992, GNP was widely used as a proxy of output. Okay? But after 1992, GDP has taken over the importance of GNP. So gross national product, GNP, refers to the output produced by American-owned inputs regardless of the location. So in other words, gross national product is very much nationality specific. Okay? Gross domestic product refers to output produced within the border of the United States, regardless of the nationality of inputs. So in other words, gross domestic product is very much geographically specific. So let's go back to the example that we mentioned just now, General Motors. General Motors is an American company. So when General Motors produce cars in Japan, those cars are not the GDP of the United States. Those cars are GDP of Japan. However, if you want to use GNP as a proxy of output, then you can say that these cars are the GNP of the United States because they are produced by an American-owned entity, General Motors. So now let's take next, why don't we just take 10 minutes or so? Okay? Let's take 10 minutes or so to complete this exercise. So for each one of these transactions, let's determine whether it can be counted as the GDP of the United States for the year of 2010. Okay, so let's just spend about 10 minutes and we'll come back to that.